Thanks to everyone, especially our panelists, for participating in Is America Ready for Supercharged AI? Planning for the Quantum Future. So our conversation today is going to focus on what we think at the R Street Institute is one of the most exciting emerging technology areas that's developing today. There's a lot happening in quantum computing, and some people who are participating here in the audience today may be quantum scientists. Some may be public policy leaders who have no idea what a qubit is. We're going to go through all of that. We're going to give everyone a baseline today, but really focus in on those policy challenges and the implications around quantum computing. So very excited to have the guests that we have here today. But before I dive in, I just want to encourage you to follow the R Street Institute on Twitter, other social media platforms, and continue to read our scholarship that we're producing in this space. R Street has recently launched a Quantum User Expansion for Science and Technology Coalition, Quest, that's very focused on what's happening in the quantum space. And we're excited to share more about that with you in the months to come. So let's kick off. I want to introduce our panelists today. I'm Miles Taylor. I work as a senior fellow at the R Street Institute, focused on emerging technology policy. And first in our panelist lineup here, I've got the Honorable Chris Fall, who most recently served as the Senate-confirmed Director of the Department of Energy Office of Science. The Office of Science is the nation's largest supporter of basic research in the physical sciences and is responsible for 10 of the 17 DOE national laboratories. Dr. Fall came to DOE from the Office of Naval Research, where he served as an acting chief scientist and lead for Research Directorate and Deputy Director of Research, Director of the International Liaison Office, and the ONR Innovation Fellow. Fall also served for 3 years across 2 administrations in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as Assistant Director for Defense Programs, and then as the acting lead for the National Security and International Affairs Division. He came to public service from academia, where his focus was basic neurobiology and bioengineering, earned his PhD in neuroscience and bachelor's in mechanical engineering at the University of Virginia, and an MBA from Northwestern University. Dr. Fall, you are going to be our technical expert, it sounds like, today in this conversation, as he shakes his head. We appreciate you being with us. Next, we have Scott Friedman, who is a senior policy advisor at the House Homeland Security Committee, where he works for ranking member John Katko from New York. In this capacity, Scott advises the ranking member on a wide range of national security matters with a focus on geopolitical threats, economic competitiveness in the context of national security, and cyber issues. Scott previously worked at the Department of Homeland Security, where he advised on foreign investment risk management and emerging economic threat analysis. And prior to that, he served as senior policy advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. Scott is previously an officer in the United States Army's 82nd Airborne Division. He deployed twice to Afghanistan for Operation Enduring Freedom and held progressive levels of leadership in areas of strategy, operations, and logistics. His military honors include the Bronze Star and Meritorious Service Medal. Mr. Friedman has a bachelor's degree in international studies from American University. Finally, I'm happy to introduce Allison Schwartz and Kate Weber. Allison Schwartz is the Global Government Relations and Public Affairs Leader at D-Wave Systems, which is a leading quantum computing company. At D-Wave, Allison is building a bridge to policymakers, influencers, and academia on the benefits that quantum computing can have in the global environment. Prior to D-Wave, she was the Vice President of Government Relations at Andy, working on using rapid DNA technology during emergency response incidents and for national security initiatives. As an upstate New York native with over 20 years of experience in public policy, Allison has worked with NGOs, policymakers, and national and global organizations to showcase how data and technology can align with global society and needs and sustainable development goals. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Tulane University. And finally, Dr. Kate Weber, who currently serves as the public policy lead for quantum computing at Google. Kate previously served as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow and a Division Chief in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs at the Department of State. Kate holds her PhD in molecular biology from the University of Cambridge, where she was a Marshall Scholar, and a bachelor's degree in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of Richmond. I feel incompetent being on a panel with such esteemed individuals, and I am excited to welcome you all today. So first, we're going to do this. We've got a number of folks who are participating who have no background whatsoever in quantum computing. And so I think we need to start with a baseline and talking about what quantum computing actually is, why it's different than classical computing, and why it's going to have a huge impact on the world as we see it. So I'm going to give us 60 seconds, and I'm going to put one person here on the spot. And it's only because I've known her for some time. I'm going to put Kate Weber on the spot and see if in 1 minute or less, she can give us a primer on quantum computing that's somewhat non-technical, and then others can jump in and help her if she needs to phone a friend.
Thanks for that, Miles. You might need to handle the clock here and cut me off. But so I think many of you will know that in a classical computer, in your laptop, whatever, information is encoded in what we call bits, these strings of zeros and ones. So the fundamental difference between a classical computer and a quantum computer is that in a quantum computer, information is encoded in what we call quantum bits or qubits that behave according to the laws of quantum mechanics. So depending on how much physics education you have in your background, you may know that quantum mechanics is basically the properties of matter at a very, very small scale. Matter, it behaves differently than what we can see. And the laws of quantum mechanics mean that you can do interesting things with qubits. You can get them to communicate with each other, to calculate probabilities in ways that are not possible with a classical computer. That requires a lot of really tough engineering to get these qubits to behave according to the laws of quantum mechanics. There are different ways of doing that, and D-Wave and Google and some of the other companies that are developing quantum computers are building those qubits in different ways. But ultimately, it means that the kinds of calculations you can do are very powerful and many of them are not possible on a classical computer. And we'll talk more about what those sorts of applications might be.
Fantastic. Kate, Price is Right rules, you lost because you went over, but it was a spectacular answer. So we appreciate that. I would love to bring in Allison and Chris and Scott. Big picture, as folks are trying to wrap their heads around, what quantum computers are. There's a lot of heuristics that people use to try to explain it in layman's terms. I wonder if there's any other useful anecdotes you would provide about quantum technology. And I'll just put one forward that I've talked a lot about with Kate. There's a famous quote from a leading scientist in the quantum realm that nature isn't classical, damn it. In other words, nature is not encoded in zeros and ones, but because quantum computers rely on nature and fundamental physics, you can model nature in the way that it exists, which makes this exponentially more powerful and impactful than a classical computer. I wonder if Allison, Chris, Scott, anything else to throw in there on that subject?
Well,
go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead, Allison.
No, okay, so one thing I would say to rely on, connect kind of what Kate had said about how quantum mechanics works, as well as what Miles was talking about, is that not every problem needs a quantum computer, and not every problem needs an exact, different type of system. And so if you're modeling different things, there could be a pretty simple solution in a classical computer that can work. But as you're looking at things that get exponentially harder and go beyond the capabilities of classical computers, at that point, you're looking at hybrids, you're looking at quantum computers, different systems. Google has what's called a gate system, D-Wave has an annealing system. Different qubits, as Kate mentioned, are able to act in different ways. But Miles, you're absolutely right that nature is not in a 1 or a 0. And so if we're going to try and model things and try and create new materials and do things in a really new and robust way, you need quantum computing in order to be able to have that power to achieve that.
Great. Chris, you had thoughts?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thanks to Kate for breaking the ice there. It's hard to explain, but there are, we talk about quantum computing as if it's one thing, and there are, different kinds of quantum computing, right? As Allison just said, and it's not. So if you think about a problem like Google Maps or something like that, getting from A to B in a map. It's not so obvious that the best way to do that was to first translate in that into ones and zeros and start adding and subtracting numbers. That's an artificial consequence of the kinds of computers that we have now, mainly digital computers. But computing, big computing started out analog. It started out with analog differential equation solvers, much more analogous to the quantum world than the digital computer itself. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Fantastic. And I will say, I think audience members have picked up on this. If you do have questions today, please feel free to put them in the chat. And as we go about the discussion, we'll try to pepper some of those in, but primarily we're going to try to save questions for the end of the discussion. So in the second half here today, we'll try to dive into some of that Q&A, but please feel free to plug those in and I'll be scanning those as we go through the conversation. So on that topic, Chris, about classical computers being different from quantum computers, it was once described to me that you would not use a Ferrari to drive to your mailbox at the end of the driveway. You would walk to go get the mail in the mailbox, and you use a Ferrari on the Autobahn. And it strikes me that quantum computers are best suited for those very, very complex tasks. So you end up in a scenario in a far out future where you're likely to have the classical computer that's basically inside your iPhone still operating adjacent to what might be a quantum computer. I wonder if how you all are thinking of that from the private sector perspective. So I guess Allison and Kate, what does that future look like, and how do those two machines live together?
Well, I'll go first and then I'll turn it over to Kate. So, as I said, not every problem needs a quantum computer. So there will always be a place for classical computing systems. And not every problem is solved on each systems equally. There's some science right now that talks about annealing is really great for optimization problems. Gate is really great. Gate systems are really great for quantum chemistry and material sciences. And so where I view the kind of future to be, almost all of these quantum systems are at a level now that you're able to tap into them via the cloud, either through personal platforms that companies have, or like AWS and Microsoft have broader platforms, that you'll end up actually tapping into a quantum computer that solves your problem the best, depending on the problem that you have. And so it will actually not be, DOE having to buy 17 different types of computers and house them. It's how do you tap into the cloud? And when Department of Transportation has a problem with infrastructure, or you're looking at DOE on electrical grid resiliency, they can all submit those problems via the cloud and actually work with the different industries to find out which solution is better.
So let me ask this question, and Kate, would love for you or maybe Scott to jump in and answer this one. We've talked a little bit about the mechanics behind it, not so specifically the quantum mechanics, but why do quantum computers matter? In other words, what are they going to be able to do? What are the near-term and long-term applications of this technology that we should be thinking about? Things we should be excited about, things we should be worried about. Why does this matter to the average American?
Happy to kind of dive into that. I mean, certainly very important that we get the private sector's view on this, because at the end of the day, that's what's kind of exciting about our country, is that we have the capacity, we have these, companies that are, doing the next generation technology here, and they are, doing research and they're doing development that's not happening anywhere else in the world. I think when we think about frontier technology in general, but quantum computing in particular, we have both the futuristic, the very egalitarian sense of what could be, and then the real world, kind of application of what it's going to be, if that makes sense. There has to be a business impetus for this. And so I think it'll be very interesting to see where we see early adoption and first movers. I think right now, anyone who acknowledges that big data is a part of their core business process will be very inclined to try and incorporate quantum computing in their operational posture. I think this presents kind of two very interesting challenges for us as a society and as a government. One is that we do not have a handle on data in general. We do not know how to value it. We don't know how to protect it. We don't really know, where it's going and what we can do with it. We, I think, are at the very beginning of that conversation. We are seeing both positives and negatives from significant data sets being produced, manipulated, and whether that be monetized or exploited. There's a whole range of things happening that as a society we're just trying to figure out now. And the second is, as I mentioned earlier, we don't really understand where this could go in a very positive way. I think that we are acknowledging that technology, just as it exists, doesn't always take the form that we would really hope it could be. And when we think about things like encryption, which we've always, kind of leaned on as the fail-safe for many of our digital, much of our digital life is the thing that keeps us safe, keeps privacy safe, keeps us, national security secrets protected. Suddenly, we might be in a reality where that's no longer true. Although in this country, we're profit-seeking, and that's positive, and so folks try and find positive and beneficial uses for technology that they develop. This is a race, and there are other elements in other societies in the world that may not view the developments and the applications of these breakthroughs in the same way we will. And again, when you take that in conjunction with the sheer volume of information this kind of technology will produce, we have some very difficult problems ahead of us that we need to be very thoughtful about how we approach.
Well, thanks, Scott. And with that, I want to ask Kate, and then go on down the line here. Let's focus first on near-term applications. This is a technology that for years we've said is a long ways out. And now people still, when they read about quantum computers, read that we're still about 10 years away from a quantum computer that can break encryption, that can break the tools that we use to protect our emails and our health records, and as Scott noted, our national security secrets. We're still a decade away from that universe. What can be done between now and then practically to demonstrate that quantum machines can affect everyday life for Americans?
Yeah, so I think I'm sure that Allison can talk about applications for D-Wave systems as well. For Google at the moment has what we refer to as a noisy intermediate scale quantum processor. This basically means that we have a processor, like a small scale computer, a chip with 59 qubits that can calculate very simple things. And we're in a stage where we're doing a lot of research ourselves, a lot of theoretical and practical research on potential applications for this stage of processor before we get to the point where we have what is known as an error-corrected computer. That refers to correcting errors introduced from the environment into the qubits. They need to communicate with each other in a very specific way. And the bottom line is that that's very easily disrupted by the environment. That's one of the biggest technological challenges to developing these quantum computers. So what can we do with them now? I mean, we don't really know. I think that's a big challenge between now and when we do develop the fault tolerant machine, because we need to, as others note, we need to show that these are useful. We also need to kind of keep pushing towards that general purpose computer. There are a number of potential applications. We've done some early stage kind of chemistry simulations. I think a couple of folks have mentioned that things like molecular simulation are expected to be some of the really powerful applications for quantum computing, because we are dealing with qubits that behave according to the same laws that molecules behave according to, So in terms of, I just want to address kind of the other point I think that both Scott and you have sort of referenced here, Miles, which is that we do expect these fault-tolerant computers. Google is aiming to develop one of those by 2030 to be able to break Shor's algorithm, which is the basis for RSA encryption. I think that's, it's an important point that everybody be aware of and know the actions that should be taken now. But it's also important to remember that quantum computing, we can address that risk pretty effectively without having the fault-tolerant computer. We can use classical cryptography to address that. And NIST is developing standards for post-quantum cryptography. And the challenge then will be implementing those to protect sensitive information, which is a big challenge, but it's a little bit separate from the quantum computing development track.
Wow. Well, Allison, I'd love to ask you about this. And I know that, you know, Kate's company, Google, and full disclosure, previously a Googler, had achieved something that they called quantum supremacy. So, you know, their quantum machine solved a problem in about 90 seconds that would take the world's fastest supercomputer that, you know, Chris Fall, you know, would have overseen at the Department of Energy 10 years to solve. 90 seconds would have taken the fastest computer in the world 10 years. So quantum computers are doing things now, very hard things. What are the near-term applications that you all see in these coming years?
Thanks so much for the question. And, you know, I want to echo a little bit of what Kate said. There is a journey here with quantum computers and the advancement of the hardware in order to get there, and the advancement of the software layer that goes on top of that. We actually opened up access to our platform for COVID. Anybody working on COVID can come in, use our system for free from March of 2020 to March of 2021. We had over 280 researchers come in and actually develop applications. They did everything for evacuation routes, optimizing evacuation routes for tsunami. They did optimizing nurse scheduling because you had issues with whether or not they had enough nursing staff or you had too many patients in one area. These were both in Japan. We had folks in Canada that came in and were looking at how to optimize the different systems in a retail establishment because they had certain things that had to be done, but they couldn't have as many staff in there. You had folks coming in for manufacturing optimization. We had a startup called Menton AI that was doing protein folding and is now in wet lab testing for COVID response. So there's a lot that can actually be done with the technology today. I would say the bucket of problems are true optimization problems. Those are really difficult. The bigger they get, the more complex they get. We did something with the Australian Army where we were looking at resupplying with autonomous vehicles. And if you had, you know, 2 depots going to 3 places, a classical computer could solve that pretty efficiently. But the minute the problem got bigger and you had 50 depots, 100 trucks going to 200 places, that problem was too big for the classical computer, and you needed a quantum, you know, hybrid solver in order to get in there and be able to provide an optimal solution. Now add that into emergency response, which I know is in Congressman Katko's, you know, bucket. How are you going to do an efficient emergency response with wildfires out west or hurricanes down south, or even optimizing vaccine distribution or looking at the next COVID outbreak pandemic and how it's going to spread? Those are problems that actually optimization problems that could be used on the technology today. And that's one thing I encourage government to start up as a near-term application programs and seeing what is the art of the possible with the technology today while we continue to advance the hardware.
I'm excited to get to that in a few minutes. I want to turn in a few minutes here to quantum computing development, where we're at, where we need to be going. But maybe I'll go down the line again here, and you know, Chris and Scott, let's talk about the long term, and certainly Kate and Allison weigh in on this. But paint the far out picture for us, and I'll start with the layman's view, which is that, you know, folks will say, the distant future of quantum computing is that, as the title of our event today suggests, is it will supercharge artificial intelligence in ways that are great, in ways that are potentially worrisome. You know, a top quantum scientist, I won't cite who, some of you will know who this is because I've told the story before, but you know, had a conversation with me walking on a beach in California, and I said to this person, you know, where's quantum computing going? We talk about 10 years from now and breaking encryption. Where's it going to be in the 2030s? And this person said, well, hypothetically, I could develop a quantum machine in the 2030s that gives machines a genuine analog to human emotions. In other words, a robot that's authentically happy or sad or even angry. So, you know, someone like me hears that and thinks the T-1000 from Terminator. Is that where we're going? You know, either spook us, Chris, or disabuse us of that fear.
And I don't know if Hal was, you know, had emotions or not. Hard to tell from the modulated voice, but yeah, you know, what's clear to your point, let's take the intermediate step. I don't know if we're going to have a sentient computer. I'm not in the business of of that. But this idea of, what are quantum computers good at, as Allison said, search, optimization and so forth. These are all the essential underpinnings of artificial intelligence. Of course, we're going to get, to the point where we can solve these problems much more quickly. But how far in the distant future? You said 10, 20 years. What's the biggest quantum computer now? Order 100 qubits. And everyone, the first sort of practical error correcting computer, we need something like 1 million qubits, right? To make that work really well. That's a big leap. But it's an engineering problem, not a science problem, right? And so, and in the history of engineering, we do have these, we'll misuse the word, quantum leaps, right? In technology, the cooling systems, the scale, the size, the packaging, people come up with clever ways around that just change the equation. So it's hard to say, really, because we know how to do it. We just can't get there because of the engineering. And so it's it could take that long. It actually could take a lot take a lot less time, I think, to get there. But I just wanted to why it's important. If we take a step back, one reason it's important is the computing and the problems that we're going to be able to solve. And there are just an awful lot of problems that we can't solve with our current computers or the exascale computers we're rolling out in the next couple of years. Just not possible to do that. But when it comes down to it, we're learning to manipulate single atoms at scale, reproducibly, sort of industrial scale. This is no longer laboratory projects. That's going to change the world in itself. Aside from the computing, the routine manipulation of the properties of single atoms in people's devices, in their computers, in their cars, in their whatever, that is going to change everything. And I don't think we know how it's, I don't think we have a full understanding of how that's going to happen. So anyway, I don't know about sentient computer.
If I could just dovetail off that for a second, because I think that's—
don't want your computer to be mad at you. We've seen that before.
Yeah, but I think that's a great point, Chris. I mean, both the initial conversation about— I remember I saw the first time I saw quantum computer was at CES 2019, back when we did those things. It was an IBM computer, and it was right there in the main hall, and it was like a piece of modern art, and it was really very beautiful. I had no idea what I was looking at, and I still don't really know what it was. And so I think there's an element of that, that we need to we got to take it out of the sci-fi realm and explain, how this thing is applicable in the real world, what its installation looks like, how it plugs into existing, whether it be, information technology or operational technology. That's going to be a big leap in and of itself as it integrates into people's, own lived realities. And I think the second point that Chris made is one that I would really like to foot stomp, is that if we just take a couple of technologies that, these kind of frontier technologies, let's just say 5G, synthetic biology, and virtual reality. What these things all have in common is that they're immensely data heavy. They're going to generate a tremendous amount of data. They're going to, have a lot of data to be able to be synthesized. And then the outcomes of that data will be very, very powerful for both, actual meaningful application for the user, but also for applications that we don't yet kind of fully comprehend. Quantum computing, seems to me, is the underlying reality that needs to be, well instantiated for us to really unlock all the rest of those things. And so I think there is a little bit of a chicken and the egg here of, what are the applications, or what are the kind of commercially viable entities that are going to be able to say, okay, I've got a real opportunity to differentiate myself, to bring to market or to bring to bear something that is going to change the world, because that's what we're seeking to do here. But when you put that in the geopolitical context, that's tough too, because everybody's kind of looking at the same passes. They recognize where the world is kind of where the ball's going, and I think we need to be very thoughtful about both as from private sector, but also from government. What do we care about, and where do we need to be going with that, and what benefits and challenges are we going to have ahead of us?
Thanks, Scott. Before we move on to international competition, because I do want to talk about that, and I want to get this group's sense of where the United States stands in the race towards a fully functioning quantum machine. But before I do, Kate and Allison, anything to add on the long-term future of this technology? What we can expect? Is it better self-driving cars, more efficient drones? You know, what does it look like?
I mean, I guess I would just start by saying that I think if you look back at the history of technological development, we have not been very good at predicting exactly what technologies will be good for. So with that caveat, you know, Chris talked about how we expect quantum to be very relevant for AI. Google's quantum team is called Quantum AI, right? As you can imagine, Google, one of the reasons we're invested in this technology is that potential. But I mentioned also molecular modeling, you know, things like drug discovery, materials discovery for various energy applications. Those are expected to be really powerful applications. But yeah, I mean, we don't really know. And again, like, they're going to be different kinds of applications than classical computers are good for. In some ways, it's not like we're comparing, you know, a Ferrari to a Ford. It's like a Ferrari to like a speedboat or something, right? They're totally different platforms. Yeah, so.
Well, Elon Musk says his cars can actually drive through water. So maybe we're closer to the Ferrari and the speedboat merging. Allison, anything to add on that front? And then we'll jump to international competition.
I just want to echo what Kate said, is that, you know, we really don't know what the art of the possible eventually will be. But the great thing about it is there's so much that can be done today that actually becomes an advancement loop for the hardware system to showcase where it will end up. And so being afraid of where the bad things could go and therefore not actually utilizing the technology that's available today, I think that is a harm. And instead, we have to just do it in a thoughtful way, transparent way, to make sure that we are getting to those areas where you're looking at AI. We had one customer that was using our system, and they were looking at waste optimization and how do you collect trash. And they were able to collect trash and reduce CO2 emissions by nearly 60%. You know, this is not talking about whether or not you have Terminator coming. This is a massive difference in a specific area in the globe. If you started doing that in a lot of other places, there's a big difference that can be made. So let's start taking these little steps.
I think that's actually a great segue to my next question here, which is that, you know, we've got nation states that are competing to have thriving quantum industries. The United States is very active in the space. The Russians, the Chinese, our European partners. At our street, we produced a piece recently where we talked about what we call the qubit military advantage. So I do want to talk about the national security side for a moment. What we had put out there was basically the notion that's called Nevin's Law, which is actually named for Hartmut Nevin, who's the lead quantum scientist over at Google, where Kate works, which was his conclusion that for each additional qubit added to a machine, you have a double exponential increase in computing power. And a double exponential is a big increase in compute power that you see from quantum computers. So unlike Shor's law, where we see this steady increase in computing power, you know, we're seeing a massive curve in increase in computing power that you get from each qubit that you add to a quantum machine. The reason we had published that in the international relations context was to say, in the hypothetical far out scenario that you have one nation state that's got a powerful quantum computer and one that's got a slightly more powerful computer with just a few more qubits, the one with just a few more qubits has an advantage. And let's say it's drone swarm versus drone swarm. Well, the one with 2 more qubits than the other has a inherently smarter drone swarm that potentially could defeat the other. So there really is, it seems, a fierce competition internationally towards getting to that fault tolerant quantum machine and beyond. I want to see if folks on the panel, you know, can talk a little bit about where they think the United States stands in that race currently, and then we'll talk a little bit about how America can keep up with some of the international competition and what needs to happen and what some of those threats to U.S. leadership are. So maybe we'll start with the first question. Where is the United States in the pecking order of the quantum computing ecosystem? And Chris, maybe I can go to you first, since you recently left government and you saw this from the tip of the spear.
Well, I think it depends on which exact question you're asking. I mean, notionally, at least as far as we know publicly, the Chinese have the biggest, you know, the computer with the most bits, right? The most qubits. But as I suggested before, this is a serious engineering problem, and we're pretty good at figuring out how to scale, do things at scale. So I'm not so worried in the near term. And obviously, Europe's doing, everyone's, in terms of the fundamental technology and how to put together a qubit and the material science, I think folks are, relatively on par around the world. That's my sense. But, when you talk about the military applications or the national security applications, in the near term, I don't think computing is actually the most relevant one. I think when you talk about national security applications, it's going to be sensing in the near term. I mean, these, the same technologies that let us manipulate individual atoms for qubits give us exquisite sensitivity to perturbations from whatever you're trying to understand about the world around you. And so implementing those, the sensors, and then second, in the near term would actually probably be communications. I mean, being able to send secure communications around the world through free space, et cetera. Those are closer applications, but your point's well taken. The number of qubits matters. It's going to be a foot race.
How about from the, Scott, let's go to you and then the industry perspective on where we stand.
Yeah, I mean, I defer wholly to the industry experts. The technology and the development paths, I can't particularly comment on, but I think, Allison hit the nail on the head. What are the national security applications? In fact, I'm less concerned about the military applications, or, just because you have more of something doesn't mean, you can utilize it in a way that's, impactful or really meaningful. But Allison was getting at, there's practical applications. And I think where you see adoption, that is going to drive innovation, because it improves something. It provides a service or a capability that folks will say, this makes my life materially more efficient, better, more useful, whatever it might be. And historically speaking, that is what has, allowed industries to win globally. And I think, where we see that practical application, we will see advantage. And, when we look at the geopolitical landscape, it seems to me that increasingly folks want to go with the most efficient and most capable, technology that brings the most tangible benefit to their society. And that's the fault line at this juncture that we are really playing tug of war over. And as Allison aptly stated, things that we can point to very clearly and say, this is better because of it, we will be in a much more advantageous position, geopolitically, diplomatically, economically, and from a security standpoint.
Well, and
Allison, let's go to you. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to touch on the number of qubits, because we're talking a lot about, we need to get to 1 million. Kate mentioned where Google is, D-Wave's at 5,000 qubits. We're in a needler at their gate. I mean, when you're talking about the numbers, I think that is the wrong focus right now. Nevins is right in that, yes, we are going to, bigger is better and you can do more, but it's actually, what can you do with the technology? How can you actually take it on? And industry will work against each other and figure out how we get to the next level of qubits and what we can do with that. And I agree with Chris that if you were looking at the hardware advancements and the global government looking into it, it is kind of a neck and neck race as they move forward. If you look at utilization of the quantum technology, that's where actually the US is not ahead. You have the Australian government who has mentioned they're going to be using quantum applications for optimization of railways. And their Australian military is already looking at proof of concepts for practical applications. In Japan, I've mentioned several different applications in Japan. Canada has a quantum as a service RFP. They've just announced they're going to be doing a quantum challenge, a quantum computing challenge. The US hasn't gotten there yet. So that's actually where the US is falling a little bit behind, not too far behind, but it's actually a focus that I think we need to get into. And on the military side of things, there is also, a lot of the stuff that can be done today. Yes, we talked about encryption, but like predictive fleet maintenance. How can you actually identify the fleet that the military has to have and get it move through a repair shop more optimal? How do you identify, you have logistics organizations like UPS and DHL that are using AI and quantum in order to reduce costs of gasoline. Military actually is the largest purchaser of energy. Is there a way to do things in a more optimized way to save taxpayer dollars, which then that taxpayer dollars could be used for something else? So there are little things that can be done today that can make a big difference. And I know I saw Chris's hand come up, so.
Yeah, Chris, over to you. I saw your hand up.
Well, I just want to put some, exactly. Let's take exascale computing as an example. In this country, we currently, do not have the fastest supercomputer in the world. I think that's in Japan now, but that's something that moves, every year. We will have a number of exascale computers over the next couple of years, but that's sort of the drag race metaphor, and that's not what we need here. What is profoundly important about what we're doing in this country with large scale, exascale computing is re-engineering the entire software stack, having a pipeline of applications that are being driven towards utilization on those machines, connecting them with incredibly high bandwidth data connections. So to Allison's point, it's the system, it's the applications, yes, but it's the wider, how do you plug these machines into everything else that you're doing? And that's a place where I'm confident, and history has shown that we're pretty good at doing that. We're behind now in applications and utilization, but we know how to do science at scale. We know how to do technology at scale pretty well. So I think we can be competitive, as the hardware evolves.
So that leads to a good question. And Kate, maybe we can jump over to you on this one. What are the threats to the US position, and as we've been talking about, but more specifically, how can we address them? I mean, what needs to be done in terms of public-private partnership to get to a place where, America stays as sort of a leading quantum innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, I think, building on this whole last discussion, I think the biggest need is to get more people involved in thinking about how to use quantum computers. And something that we haven't talked much about yet, and I see that Mike put a question on this in the chat, and I think it's connected, is education. Because in addition to actually discovering those applications, you need to be building a workforce now that's equipped to use these quantum computers as they mature. And I think that's a place. I was actually listening this morning to Richard Danzig speak at PCAST, and he talked about many of these issues, focusing on integration of technology, but also just with respect to China on the workforce piece. Like, one thing you can't get around is the fact that they have more people than us, and how do you think about dealing with that? Another, I think, important point on that workforce piece and on strengthening the US position is, what else can we do on international collaboration with allies, right? I think there's a lot more that we could be doing, working on together on applications discovery, on educational initiatives, and all of these pieces.
Well, and Kate, on that, the international collaboration, we also have to mention the global supply chain with that as well. Not all quantum computers need to have cryogenics, but some do. The cryogenic fridges, we have some being made in the US, but they are not the proliferation of where most of the quantum computers are getting their cryogenics. Those are in Europe. So there are ways in which there's different parts of this global supply chain, and being able to make sure we're working with our allied partners will be critically important.
Especially because that supply chain is going to evolve. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Chris, I saw your hand.
I just, again, want to foot stomp what Kate said about education and Mike's question. This is so fundamentally important because, even if you have ideas like, oh, we can, access a great quantum computer over the web, as if you type in an equation and suddenly that's not the way it works. The way the language of quantum algorithms are linear algebra and probabilities. And this is not something that we do a good job of teaching our kids from a very early stage. I mean, that's kind of where we need to be started now, getting started now, is preparing people to think about computation in a fundamentally different way, right? In order to have that, pipeline of kids, students, postdocs, whatever, who are gonna take this and fulfill the potential of it. So very important.
Great. I want to ask about federal investment specifically. I mean, folks get, cold sweats sometimes at the idea of the federal government trying to pick winners and losers in the marketplace. How do you all view the role of federal investment in catalyzing the quantum marketplace? What are the pitfalls, but what are the upsides, and what should that look like? And I'll throw a jump ball on this one, whoever raises their hand first.
Well, I'm happy to throw myself to the sharks, and then you all can, pick the corpse clean here. But I think the reality is that, and Allison said the word supply chain, and at this point, no one can have a conversation about technology without saying supply chain at least once. So let's just go there. If you look at supply chain as it most clearly manifests itself at this juncture, it's semiconductors, it's chips, right? And while that's not necessarily, wholly germane to quantum computing, the legislative effort that is around that is suddenly kind of encompassed, or at least there's, interest from quantum actor, in this space. And I think that perhaps, that is the departure point for this conversation. And anybody who's followed this, the CHIPS Act is, not going anywhere. It has not gone anywhere. I think this is for a variety of reasons you alluded to, Miles. There's both a lot of excitement about the idea of getting a lot of free money from the federal government to try and push, either theoretical or applied research. And at the same time, very concerned about what that really means, what the dispensation looks like, the timelines to that, and whatever strings attached there may or may not be. But I think the basic question here, and again, is there an element that the Fed needs to get involved in that says this is a societal need and a clearly demonstrated capability that we can move forward on? And if so, does the involvement of the federal government catalyze us forward in a way that's, both part of the national interest and good to the public? And I think we have not answered those questions yet, partially for a lot of the reasons we've had a conversation about. We're just very early in this conversation. We don't know, but perhaps we're getting, day by day, month by month, we're getting closer to something that's more real that we can kind of organize around. And I think once we get to that point, we will really be off to the races. But I think at this to date, it's too theoretical for many actors that are part of this conversation.
Allison, I want to go to you on that. What could or should the federal government be doing in this space?
Sure. One thing I just want to touch on what Scott said about the CHIPS Act. While both Google and D-Wave use superconducting chips, we actually have semiconductor chips in our supply chain. So that CHIPS Act and that a strong semiconductor industry in the US is critically important for a variety of technologies, quantum included. I think that there is a very focused area, and I know we have no appropriators on the call, so and on the panel, but I think there's a focused area where the government can actually lean in, and that is on the education point. I think opening up access. There is a bill moving through the House right now called the Quest Act, the Quantum User Access. That is actually allowing folks to tap into quantum computing, allowing folks to actually get curriculum development, having folks actually build into this, doing it from a cross-academic platform. So it's not just theoretical physicists, but it's also the engineers and the computer scientists and other ones who are going to actually look at the entire supply chain. As Chris keeps talking about, we're now on an engineering side of quantum, but we also are in the computer science for the application building, as well as that theoretical physicist of who's going to figure out that next version of a qubit that's going to exponentially have more connectivity or tackle the noise issues and the fragility of certain qubits. So I think the Quantum User Access Program is important. I think that the government should lean in, as I've mentioned a few times, on a near-term applications program, because as you're testing out the technology, you're getting feedback on hardware advancements, software advancements. And so I think that's where the government needs to come in. I do not think that they should pick winners and losers, as you said, Miles. I think they need to be technology agnostic, because again, every problem does not need a quantum computer, and not a quantum computer cannot solve every problem equally. And so we need to have the most and widest variety within these type of programs.
So if I could go, we have a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask a few of the questions from the chat. But Kate, maybe you first, and then Chris, you. Any other things to add on what the sort of federal role could be, or what public-private partnership could look like in this space?
Yeah, I mean, second Allison's references to Quest, to more focus on education, I think that the National Quantum Initiative does provide a really good framework for all of this. And I would just also emphasize that we need both of these. We need the track of practitioners and application and algorithm discovery, but we also do still need, materials scientists, folks who can contribute to the hardware efforts, because as we still have this hardware journey too. So yeah, I think that Quest on the application piece is an important development. I think more educational initiatives would be useful. I think sort of more just robust implementation of the NQI. The advisory committee for the NQI hasn't met in a while, like in terms of just like a sort of on the executive branch side, like easy next step to bring more focus into this area would be to convene that again and get broader input from the community. And then we already talked a bit about international collaboration, but setting up more formal mechanisms for that, and also just doing more to facilitate that collaboration that's already happening in the private sector.
Chris, you oversaw these programs in the national labs. What else could the federal government be doing?
Well, more is always better. We have competing priorities, but I do think on this idea of picking winners, things do need to be handled carefully. In fact, the programs in the lab, and given the commercial interest already, right? The Googles, the IBMs, the Microsofts on a big scale, and others, D-Wave. Part of the responsibility of organizations like our national labs is to keep a hand in technologies that aren't being necessarily exploited, so that because we really don't know at this point. It's early enough in the game that we don't know ultimately what the most successful technologies for implementing quantum sensing, computing, communications are going to be. So the national labs have this obligation. That said, and we've talked about this, you and I, and with others, the major science organizations like the Department of Energy have this concept of user facilities, and we should be using the concept of user facilities in quantum. And I think supporting the commercial, if the commercial side is planning to build large computers that have to be a certain scale in order to solve problems, but a scale that maybe the commercial applications can't make full use of, there is an opportunity for the federal government to come in and rent a quasi, a virtual user facility model here, so that researchers have access to those same sorts of technologies. I'm not convinced, based on what I saw when I was in office, that it's time for a national lab to start building, a quantum computer, an error-corrected quantum computer with 1 million bits. I don't know that that's a good use of public resources. But if the private sector is going to do that, we certainly want to give the scientific, academic, national lab, even in some cases the private sector doing research community, access to that if the companies are willing to do it. And then meanwhile, the smaller scale machines, the test beds and so forth, the interaction between quantum computers and supercomputers, that is something that a place like the Department of Energy and the labs could have a role in. But none of this is we're not going to squeeze all the juice out of this again without the education, the thinking about problems, the thinking about software, the bringing together of the community, and all these other functions.
Well, I want to close us out today by asking each of you to weigh in on this question of where we need to be going in terms of preparing from a public policy standpoint for the quantum future. And feel free to answer that in any way you like. But I noticed in the chat, I want to synthesize a number of different questions that were asked about AI and ethics and the biases of AI. That's a big question. Now, I'm reassured from Chris that the Terminator scenario is not imminent, and from Allison that the
But
near-term
you never really
applications.
know with the Terminator, do you?
There you go. Yeah, but the near-term applications seem to be immensely beneficial for society, our economy, and there's a lot of good things that should that can happen there. But what do we need to be doing to prepare, for that distant future where we do have smarter machines that can think for themselves, potentially machines with emotion at some point? How do we handle the AI ethical dilemmas there? But I'll let you answer that if you want to. But the base question here, starting with Kate, is how do we prepare from a public policy standpoint for a very different future and one that has powerful quantum machines?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Miles, on the ethics piece, the good news is that I wouldn't expect the questions around quantum and AI ethics to be fundamentally different than the AI ethics questions that we are grappling with now. And there is a lot of work in how to govern AI, taking into account those ethical considerations. Google has its AI principles. We apply those not just to our AI work, but also to all of our advanced technology work, including quantum. And I think that having those kinds of frameworks in place to think about these societal impacts is the first step so that we can kind of evaluate as we go along. And then in terms of just kind of laying the groundwork more broadly, I don't have a huge amount to add to the discussion just now. Just to reiterate, education focused collaboration. I think there is of course this tension here, which is underlying this whole conversation between this US competitiveness, which often involves a lot of collaboration, and protecting national security, and how should we be thinking about that, and how can we, even for some of the processes that we do have in place, and there's a lot of focus right now on export controls, for example, like how can those be targeted? Are there possible improvements to existing processes that would help facilitate our competitiveness? Those kinds of things. So even beyond just kind of the core, the education, the user access, the investments, I think there are questions like that we need to consider too.
Allison?
I'll echo what Kate said about the education and user access. I think that's critically important from a policy perspective. I think the government and members of Congress should look at quantum computing in near term, midterm, and long term. There's foundational research that needs to be done, which will likely have benefits in 10 plus years. But what can we do in the 1 to 5 year and the 5 to 10 year range? And I think that we should start with more conversations like this. Engaging with policymakers so they actually understand. Most of my conversations start with what is quantum computing and what can it really do? So I think that we need to start to answer those questions, maybe building a quantum sandbox within the government where we can start to tackle some of these public policy, public sector issues, utilizing technology so we can answer that.
Chris, are policymakers illiterate when it comes to quantum? You got to interact with a lot of them on that subject in your last role.
Yeah, I think most of us are. It's not just policymakers. It's that nobody is particular. The best experts in the world are not comfortable with quantum. It's just fundamentally something that's hard to wrap your head around. But we live in a quantum world already. Lasers are fundamentally quantum, right? Magnetic resonance imaging, fundamentally a quantum. Atomic clocks that we base our lives through GPS on. Quantum is everywhere, and this is just sort of the next step. I'm not so worried about the ethical implications because I haven't thought about it a lot, but it's not so obvious beyond encryption that there's anything fundamentally at risk that's not at risk incrementally through regular computing or other issues. I mean, this doesn't introduce a fundamentally new ethical problem in the way, for example, that autonomy does, particularly when applied to weapons and so forth. I don't think, but this educating folks, getting them comfortable, and getting on board with the fact that we're there already in many ways, and it's going to accelerate really quickly is critically important. That's sort of obvious. I'm not telling you anything you don't know.
Well, I think it's fitting then that we end with Scott, who's got a prime position on the House Homeland Security Committee, works with a lot of these members of Congress every day who can influence these issues.
Come on, Scott.
Where are we headed?
Well, I mean, listen, I think
it's all up to you, Scott.
It's all up to me. Oh boy. As we acknowledge the fact that we live in a digitally wrapped terrestrial world, Allison's right. I mean, we need to raise the level of understanding and awareness and comprehension on much of these technologies that are just merely buzzwords. And we need to be very thoughtful about the way that the normal human being is going to interpret and interact with that. I think Chris is right. I don't know if I'm so concerned about quantum necessarily as a technology unto itself, but quantum will be the engine for so many things we both understand now and can't yet conceptualize. And that is inherently scary to a lot of folks. And we need to be thoughtful about the way that's going to develop, the pace it's going to develop. And just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And on the flip side of that, we need to be looking to our left and our right and seeing where other geopolitical actors are going to take this same type of technology and capability and what that means to us as a society and as a nation. Public policymakers need to be a little bit more thoughtful in steering that conversation as this technology develops. So that's, I think, my closing thought on that and my perspective from where we stand right now.
Well, thank you. I recognize that we're a few minutes into overtime. Chris, you were going to jump in with one final thought?
Well, just to, you hate to do this, and certainly policymakers and appropriators are not inclined to accept the argument. But if there were ever a place where you go and say, trust us, this is going to change everything, we need to be investing, quantum is kind of it. I mean, all these things are just out of reach, but there's so many of them. And again, getting back to my sort of opening comment, we are manipulating single atoms, their spin, their polarity, measuring them, using to do computations. Of course, this is going to change things, right? We don't know how, but we can't not be investing.
Well, I think that's a great bumper sticker for us here at the end here. Of course, it's going to change the world. Let's invest in it. So, Scott, Chris, Allison, Kate, we cannot thank you enough. We appreciate you joining us. We appreciate those of you watching across various platforms right now. Thank you, and we look forward to having more events on this subject. And next time, we'll include more policymakers, because that seems to be the emphasis here. We'll try to get the whole Congress on. So thank you all. We appreciate it. Thanks for following the R Street Institute, and follow us online.
Thank you, and R Street.
Thank you.
Thank you, R Street.